Hello everyone. We are going to look at the different voice options in 4G in this particular presentation. Some of the discussions here would be a little bit controversial. Right. Let's start with a joke before we move on to the discussion. And this joke is an industry standard joke. That means everybody knows it. So what happened is when 3G was being designed, the main revenue during 3G or before 3G was voice and SMS. So the people in the standards they focused too much on the voice and SMS, and as a result, the data part didn't work very well. So what they said is like, okay, you know what? In 4G, we are going to focus on the data part and make sure that the data part works really, really well. As a result, they actually forgot to design voice in 4G, and this was a big issue. Actually, in all seriousness, it's because everybody assumed that it's somebody else's job to actually fix the voice part. The voice part wasn't there by default, so there had to be some hacks initially in the voice capability of 4G, and later on voice over LTE or VoLTE was basically designed to actually get over these voice issues. We will look at all these things in the discussion. So now let's get back to the serious discussions. Now you may remember I have probably discussed this in a lot of other videos. Uh, in 4G in IMT Advanced, there were three different options initially. So there was the evolution of the CDMA networks or EVDO, and that was ultra mobile broadband UMB. There was the LT, which was evolution of UMTS, and there was WiMAX. Now just remember the WiMAX part and the UMB part because neither of them really took off. So we were only left with LTE, which has been standardized. And as this picture really shows, uh, you have different ways where you can actually reach to 4G. So LDE and then which evolved to LTA was the only real 4G standard, but you can evolve go to 4G from CDMA branch, or you can go from GSM or GSM GAPRS or UMTS, or even the TDS CDMA, which is the low chip rate TDD standard, standardized in China, used only by China Mobile, as far as I know. The 4G network architecture, for reference, uh, you may remember or you may know that in case of 2G and 3G, you have two different core networks. The voice part, which is done by MSC, as shown in red here, and the packet switch core network, which is for the data, and that's done by GGSN and SGSN, as shown in blue here. In case of 4G, as I said, there is only the packet switch part. The circuit switch part is not there. That means the voice had to be designed in the packet switched core network from the beginning, and this was missing. This was introduced later on, and so it effectively came around release 10 time frame. So the initial LTE networks that were rolled out, they had to have alternative solutions. So the most common solution, or the most popular solution, which is actually still being used, is what is called as the circuit switch fallback. In circuit switch fallback, the UE uses LT network. uh, so it camps on the LT network and uses the LT network by default for data. And when there is a voice call, originating voice call or terminating voice call, then it had to do a CS fallback, right? A circuit switch fallback to the 2G or 3G network. So some of you may know that in 2G you generally do not have simultaneous voice and data unless the 2G network supports what is called as the DTM, dual transfer mode, and a lot of 2G networks don't support DTM. So um, you can have, so if you do a CS fallback from LTE to 2G, you may not have the data. You might just be able to do the voice call. If you fall back to 3G, then you will get the data rates for 3G, right? So CS fallback was designed as an interim solution until the LTE networks were rolled out completely and they start supporting the VoLTE. And in case of CS fallbacks, the UE falls back to 2G or 3G network when a voice call or SMS needs to be initiated or sent or received. Now, for the SMS part, there were other options. So many networks did not rely on CS fallback for SMS for long. They had another interface which solved the problem. So it was mainly an issue for voice. And in all honesty, um, it's not just the network, because the voice wasn't there. All the cheap handsets that were designed, they supported CS fallback because it was easy to support. And even some of the handsets available now, when 4G voice, which we will look later, is common, they only relied on CS fallback. So this is a bit of an issue. So we will be stuck with CS fallback for a long time. And because the UE just has one receiver, right, as I mentioned, the data rates after CS fallback would be the data rates offered by the 2G or the 3G network. Now there are two ways to actually do CS fallback. uh, you can have redirection. So if the UE is in idle state and it either receives a paging or it initiates like a service request, then the LTE network would actually redirect it uh, to the 3G or the 2G network. So this is called redirection. If there was a data connection already active, then instead of redirection, it would be handover. So the active data connection is handed over to the 2G or 3G network. Now in case of CDMA networks, there was another way, because when I'm talking about 2G and 3G, I'm actually talking about the GSM and its evolution, UMTS, right? But as you saw, there was another option, which is the CDMA networks. So in case of CDMA networks, uh, it did not work smoothly with LTE CS fallback. So they had to come up with some different solution. And this solution, one of this solution was called SVLTE, simultaneous voice and LTE. So in this, what happened is uh, there were two radios. So the UE would basically simultaneously connect to the 3G network, which is the CDMA or EVDO, and it will also connect to the LTE. So this was known as the dual radio concept, and separate registration takes place for the CDMA, EVDO, and the LTE networks. Each network need not be aware of what the UE is doing with the other one. Now, since voice and data are independent, one of them does not impact the other one. Now, as I mentioned earlier for GSM, the CDMA networks had the same issue, that you cannot do voice and data simultaneously. Actually, you could, but that was an evolution, and the network and the devices needed to support what was called as SVDO, simultaneous voice and data only, right? And some of the CDMA networks and some of the devices, and a lot of devices actually didn't support the SVDO. So you had the same issue to resolve. So you had to have SVLTE, and this was the most popular approach in case of the CDMA networks. There was also something called SGLTE, simultaneous GSM and LTE, but this was not popular, and this was only remember when I was showing the evolution paths, if you actually evolved from the 2G 2.5G as in GSM GPRS to LTE because the networks did not support dual transfer mode. If you fall back from LTE to 2G, right, to GSM GPRS, you may not get data, or you may get data at really low speeds. So to avoid this issue, SGLTE was another option which was adopted by some of the handset manufacturers. Most notable of them was Windows Phone. So at MWC in 2014, Microsoft announced that the Windows 8.1 phone will support SGLTE. So the same concept as SVLTE, but this is just for the GSM part. Another option is the single radio LTE, SRLTE. Now, in some cases, SRLTE uh, has also been mentioned as suspend resume LTE, but it doesn't really matter. So SRLTE was a very specific case which was actually used by Apple in iPhone. If I'm not mistaken, it was probably iPhone 5s, 5C kind of thing, and they used this approach. So let's discuss what happens in SRLT. So you have, it's the same case as SVLT. It's only for the CDMA eVideo networks, but instead of having two receivers, you have just like a one receiver. So the UE registers with both the LTE as well as the CDMA network, but when there is a voice call, it only does the voice call with the CDMA. So there is no data going on with the LTE network, right? And that means you're basically doing a suspend of data. And once the call is over, you basically resume the data. So this is a bit of an issue, and because the iPhones, this particular model of iPhones which were used on Verizon and Sprint network, they had this SRLTE. uh, the experience wasn't that great for the users, because we know when you have a voice call, you have no data. So SRLT is effectively the same as SVLT but single radio. SVLT was dual radio, and only Apple implemented it. Separate registration takes place, but each network is not aware of what the U is doing on the other one. Only voice or data can be done at any time, not both. And one of the things which happens is the UE scans the paging channel. So because remember, now you have two different networks. So even though right now it's doing data exchange in LTE, it has to regularly keep on monitoring the CDMA network paging slot, right? So when it's doing that, it cannot send or receive any LTE data. Now this wastes resources of the LTE network, and the cell throughput goes down. So it's not a very efficient approach, but the motivation for Apple to use this approach was they wanted to keep the phone slim, and they didn't want it to use too much power, because one of the problems with dual radio is actually it uses double the power. So this was the approach which they used. Right, so all these different SXLT, as I call them, they were strongly discouraged because devices became more expensive, because of two different radios. They consumed nearly double the power, so higher power consumption. uh, the it does not allow the legacy networks to be switched off, because the ideal aim is to basically switch off all these legacy networks, right? And you only have 4G networks. You can actually refarm the frequencies from the 2G and 3G legacy networks, and it can also have a competitive disadvantage. And I'll tell you another little secret. So what happened, one of the biggest competitors when LTE was being standardized, and actually initially the initial plan was the standards, each release of LTE was supposed to take like 2 years, but because WiMAX was a big threat and it was a really good competitor, all the standardization process speeded up. So instead of having meetings every 3 months, 3GPP delegates used to meet every 1.5 months, right? And the worry was that with WiMAX being in such a strong position, if you allowed the SVLT approach, the dual radio approach, somebody can actually take a WiMAX radio for the data part, and they can take a 2G radio for the voice part, put them together in the phone, and you can have like a hybrid phone, hybrid WiMAX and 2G phone. And this would actually create a lot of problem for the existing operators. So as a result, the operators and as well as the manufacturers, they were strongly discouraged from having any kind of SXLT approach. Right. Now let's look at the different bearers which are used in 4G. So as you can see, so depending on the QCI, the quality class indicator, or the QoS, you can say, the quality of service, you have different kind of bearers, right? So you have the ones at the bottom which are the non guaranteed bitrate, and the ones on the top are the guaranteed bitrate, and they have different priorities. So by default, uh, the when the UE registers on the 4G network, it establishes a default bearer which is either QCI 8 or QCI 9, and it doesn't really matter whether it's QCI 8 or QCI 9, because if there is going to be just one default bearer which is actually created by the network for everyone, uh, it doesn't really matter. It's the different QCIs are different priorities. But let's say an operator can decide to have both QCI 8 and QCI 9, and whether you are a business customer or a non-business customer, they can give you different types of bearers. So if you're a business customer, you might get QCI 8, right, which has got slightly higher priority than QCI 9, which is for non-business customers. So it's very much possible. Then you have the QCI 5, right, and this is needed for IMS signaling. So when you have the 4G voice, right, 4G voice calling or VoLTE, you have the IMS signaling. So you have a default bearer for the IMS network, which is the QCI 5. As you can see, it's higher priority than the QCI 8, QCI 9. And finally, for the voice part, you have the QCI 1, which is like the highest priority bearer. So it's got higher priority than all other default and the signaling bearers, right? Because the voice is real time, and you want to keep the quality as good as you can. So but let's look initially at the QCI 8 9 for the default bearer. So when you have something like VoIP or voice over IP or any kind of data exchange with the LTE network, it goes through a default bearer. Okay, so the default bearer is established in the EPC, and the EPC, basically the access point APN, the access point network, is basically decides where this particular data will go. So if you have a VoIP application, right, like Skype or WhatsApp or Viber or anything, the voice goes as data. So it's the same as any other data. Now LTE networks have a very high quality by default. So you may notice that actually the VoIP is good enough, but there is no separate higher priority or any separate QCI possible for VoIP applications. A network can actually decide to have a separate dedicated bearer for VoIP application, but then they will have to make like a special arrangements and with for one particular application or some things like that. So it is possible, but most networks don't go that route. So just to give an example, so when I talk about over the top applications, right, you can have all these different ones, for movies, right, like Netflix, or for music you have this Spotify, for social you have the Facebook, Twitter, Skype, WhatsApp, right, for sports, for productivity, for health and fitness. So why do we need a 4G voice when we can have OTT apps and you can have voice over IP? Why do we need 4G voice? because 4G is better. 4G voice is the only option for MNOs that has no legacy infrastructure. So we looked at the CS fallback, right, and SVLT and all those things. But what if there is an operator who decides that they will only roll out 4G? So they didn't have any 2G or 3G network. They come up with the 4G network. How do they do voice if there is no 4G voice? Also, once you have the 4G voice, the existing operators who have 2G and 3G networks, they can refarm the spectrum. That means they can use the spectrum from 2G and 3G networks for 4G. 4G voice has better quality than the 2G and 3G voice. While you are making and receiving voice calls, you have faster data rates available. Now, I know many times people actually say, but oh well, it doesn't really matter. But think of it like this. If you are using your phone also as a hotspot for other devices, right? Suddenly you get a voice call and you do a CS fallback onto a 2G or 3G network. All these other devices, like there may be other people on their laptops using your phone's hotspot, everybody's data throughput will go down. If it's 2G, maybe the data will stop completely, right? With 4G, all these things are not impacted. It also 4G also keeps everything simple because you don't have to do like a fallback. So there is additional signaling and additional messaging. And 4G remaining on 4G and having 4G voice, that means you don't have to register onto a 2G and 3G network by default, so you have a better battery life. You don't have to do monitoring of the neighboring cells and all kinds of things. So this is how the 4G voice happens. So remember, you had the default bearer, which is actually used for data and even for VoIP and other OTT or any kind of applications. Now, in addition to that, you have additional bearers. So when we looked at the QCIs and we looked at the bearers, so the blue one, would be the signaling one, would be QCI 5, right, for IMS signaling, whereas the red one will be the QCI 1, which is the VoLTE bearer. So you have multiple bearers now when you have the voice over LT. So remember, voice is independent of data and is carried by different bearer, and additional signaling and data bearer is used for VoLTE. Now, a question that is often asked is, can voice work independently of data? So in case of 2G and 3G, especially on our devices, we used to have an option where we might just switch the data off because we want to do voice only, right? Can you do something similar in 4G? Because everything is data now. There is no separate CS and PS domains. So can you switch off the data? And this question is asked in many fora many times. So in theory, yes, you can not have default bearer, right? So that means you have no data going on, but at the same time you still have your IMS signaling bearer and the VoLTE bearer. So in theory, yes, it's not an issue. In practice, it depends on how a particular vendor has implemented. So in some cases, uh, some vendors and some operators, what they do is, if the phone supports VoLTE, then they do not establish a separate default bearer. They actually use the IMS signaling bearer, the QCI 51, as a default bearer, right? Whereas some of the other operators, they will have a default bearer as well as IMS signaling bearer. Again, if you can have a separate IMS signaling bearer which can actually manage the data and everything, then you don't have to worry. So even if you don't have a default bearer, your signaling messages, especially the NAS signaling and everything, that can all go using the the IMS signaling bearer. So there is no standard answer. In theory, it should work. In practice, again, it all depends on how a particular vendor and the operator have implemented their APNs and everything. Now there are times when you need to actually hand over from LTE to 2G 3G, and this particular section is just for completion. So what happens when your device moves out of the LTE area and goes to 2G 3G? If it's the plain old circuit switch fallback, then it's not an issue, right? Because the device will continue in 2G or 3G. But what if you have 4G voice? What are the options? So one of the options is voice over LT to voice over HSPA handover. But this is only really possible if a particular operator had implemented voice over HSPA. And as far as I know, most operators have not implemented this particular option. So VoLTE to voice over HSPA, even though it's in theory possible, I'm not sure if any devices or any networks really support this one. The other option is single radio voice call continuity. And in this particular case, so initially the phone, as you can see, is camped on the 4G, and it's having a call with the through the IMS core. When it actually hands over to moves out of the 4G coverage area, the call has to be rerouted through the circuit switched core, right? So this is known as the single radio voice call continuity. So in the earlier case where we have voice over VoLTE to voice over HSPA handover, the call continues through a PS core. But in this case, the voice call continues on CS core. So just to see how this would work. So initially the voice path, as you can see from the UE, is via EUTRAN and via the serving and the PDN gateway, and then via the IMS core network. After SRVCC, the voice path changes. So now the voice path is going from the IMS core to the circuit switched MSC core, and then it's via UTRAN or GRAN to the UE. So this was a very brief overview of how voice works in the 4G network. Uh, I hope you actually liked it, and if there are any comments, please feel free to leave your comments in the comment section. Thank you.